On March 4, 1918, a soldier was reported ill at Camp Funston in central Kansas, an army base that trained men for combat in World War I. By the end of the year, 24 of the 36 large army camps in the United States faced outbreaks with tens of thousands of people falling sick. 1918 was the year of the Spanish influenza, which was so powerful that it infected 1/3 of the world's population. But the aftermath of the disaster also led to unexpected social changes. Although the Spanish influenza pandemic lasted just 15 months, it was the deadliest disease outbreak in human history. It left more than 50 million people dead, and 25% of the U.S. population became sick. The pandemic killed more people than AIDS killed in 40 years, and the bubonic plague killed in 100 years. World War I provided the optimal conditions for the flu to spread. As the flu commonly spread through the air, soldiers were very quickly infected as they lived in close quarters with many others. Along with malnutrition and the stress of the war, the soldiers experienced weakened immune systems, which led to so many more people being infected. When soldiers returned back home, they spread the flu to civilian populations. In the 1918 journal edition of the American Medical Association, it was noted that, quote, medical science for 4.5 years devoted itself to putting men on the firing line and keeping them there. Now, it must turn with its whole might to combating the greatest enemy of all, infectious disease, end quote. The spread of the flu was also fueled by public health officials and politicians' desire to underplay the severity. There was less coverage about the flu in the press at the start of the pandemic because the officials wanted to avoid panic and preserve public order. However, by the end of 1918, many cities had ordinances that required people to wear their face masks in public, and New York City had an ordinance that would fine or jail people that would not cover their cough.
It was prevalent. The greatest problem, of course, was getting medication. Only had one doctor, Dr. Andres, a wonderful man. He did the best he could. We had no penicillin, no sulfa, nothing to treat that dreadful disease. Of course, there was wagon loads of sick people lined up at his front door all the time. If you loaded a sick person whom you could no longer help and put them in a wagon, which is what most transportation was, put them in that vehicle and take them to Dothan, to a hospital, that chances are that patient would be dead when they got there. Okay, if it wasn't, there would be no room. The rooms would be filled. The doctors would be worked to capacity.
In 1918, scientists could not conduct laboratory tests to detect and diagnose flu viruses, so prevention and treatment methods for the flu were limited. There were no vaccines, antiviral drugs, or antibiotics available for treating the flu or the secondary bacterial infections that came with it. Therefore, control efforts worldwide were limited to interventions such as isolation, quarantine, use of disinfectants, limiting public gatherings, and having good personal hygiene. But they could only do so much to stop the spread of the flu and the increasing number of deaths worldwide.
And lots of times I would come in and I would cry because of all the sickness that was around me. And I knew that that sickness was deadly. It was depressing to me.
The Spanish influenza was a great tragedy and devastating to people all around the world, but there was also a small silver lining as it served as a catalyst for the women's suffrage movement. Although the women's suffrage movement had been active since the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, the Spanish flu's impact was the final step in the momentum for women gaining more freedom, independence, and a louder voice in the political arena. During the pandemic, the United States faced severe shortages of professional nurses since most nurses had been deployed to military camps in the United States and abroad. The American Red Cross began putting out calls for trained nurses and untrained volunteers who could help with emergency centers. Through the volunteer system, around 40 nurses ended up caring for about 3,000 patients who otherwise could not access private nursing. Previously, nurses had acted as physicians' assistants, but during the pandemic, the nurses ended up acting independently of doctors. The nurses were the ones who treated patients and prescribed medications. Women, including minority groups like African Americans, entered the nursing field in growing numbers during this time period. Additionally, as the virus disproportionately affected men, who were also the ones that were drafted to war, there was a great shortage of labor. This led to the number of women joining the workforce skyrocketing. Between 1880 and 1910, the number of women employed in the United States increased from 2.6 million to 7.8 million. After World War I, the number of women in the workforce was 25% higher than it was before. Women began becoming involved in employment roles in manufacturing and the textile industry, which were traditionally held by men. Women also began serving as clerks, typists, secretaries, mechanics, drivers, and bookkeepers, and they were also permitted to join the armed forces for the first time in American history and even serve in the Women Air Force Service Pilots, known as WASPs. A group of women known as the Hello Girls served as the telephone operators of the United States Army Signal Corps, greatly supporting communication during wartime. And as more women began taking traditionally male workplace roles, they began to demand equal pay for their work, since the average woman's salary had been around $31 a week, but the average man's salary had been approximately $54 a week. As women gained more economic power and therefore financial independence, they also demanded equal social independence. Even President Woodrow Wilson began to argue that women had been a crucial part of the American war effort and economy, and that they should be given the right to vote. Then, in 1920, women gained political power with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. More and more women began actively advocating for women's rights issues. Women also became more involved in community decision-making. The National Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs was founded to eliminate sex-based discrimination in the workforce, making sure women get equal pay and creating a comprehensive equal rights amendment. In conclusion, the Spanish flu pandemic drastically affected the lives of many people both in the United States and abroad. The tragedy of a pandemic led to the triumph of American women gaining their political rights and achieving greater social and economic freedom, forever changing the culture of the United States.